Okay, well, we kind of hit some highlights, and we've talked about the Bible theologically, and now we're going to talk about the Bible from a literary perspective, and which gets into storytelling, and which is a big deal for me. I love stories, and I love storytelling. But there is more to it than simply a story, just for a story's sake. And when I say the Bible is literature, I don't mean that then now we're going to put down everything that we've talked about, which is theologically about the Bible, and then pick it up and look at it in a different context. It's that these things weave together and they build upon each other. So, and kind of foreshadowing, next week we will talk about, kind of personal growth and communion and our relationship with God in that, in how we read the Bible. And so you can kind of see how these things start to come together. You have the theology, about God, and then what the story tells us. So to set this whole thing up, everything tonight is about literature. And I said what I wanted everybody to think about was your favorite Bible story, which Katie challenged me on. She's like, should we have a favorite Bible story? And so it's the last time I give homework to Katie, because she's so good at coming up with the different angle that I didn't think about, because I've got all my answers prepared, and then she comes up with the one piece that I had not prepared for. So. But to bring us back here, the whole thing here, why are we doing this? As we move through life, this thing called sanctification, discipleship, growing as disciples, God's word is the mechanism which He speaks to us, and so. Of course, 2 Timothy here again, and you're going to hear me keep saying this, but all Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. Now, we talked about this in context of God, and this week this applies because why give us the Bible? Because God wants us to learn about Him. That's the theology, and then He wants us to learn truth, and the truth is conveyed through the story that's in the Bible. Now, favorite Bible stories. And I grabbed this quote from C.S. Lewis, and I should have mentioned this. This may not work out. I'm looking down at my phone, and it's distracting me. Every picture, almost every picture in here has a story to it. And it kind of started that way and happened. This picture, did you recognize this one? Mm-hmm. This is in Glacier National Park, the Trail of the Long Pines, I think is what it's called. But it's a hike back into this beautiful snowmelt lake, and most of the hike is along the river that comes out of it. But it's beautiful. This one isn't a picture that I took, but I did a C.S. Lewis quote and saw this picture, and I thought, wow, it's if you've read the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there is a stone table. And I saw this picture, and this is one I saved a long time ago because this was a really cool picture. Like, look at that. It fits perfectly. And the reason you'll see that kind of thing throughout this in the background pictures as well. But the imagery here is part of it. And as we talk about favorite Bible stories, that's an important part of it, because when you hear a story, you get an image. And for me, I saw this picture and I immediately connected it to a story, and I immediately unpacked that entire story in my mind. And so that's one of the things that I want to get across here. So anybody want to jump in and throw out their favorite Bible story? Gideon. Interesting. You should have been in Sunday school a couple weeks ago. Gideon's a good one. There's a reason not necessarily for Gideon's sake itself, but there's a part about Gideon that I think is very interesting. Anybody else? David and Goliath. Yeah. He said that for your benefit. It really is not his favorite. He just was looking ahead.
Does a parable count as a story?
A parable? Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
The prodigal son.
The prodigal son. Okay.
Sticks out.
Okay. I thought you were going to say Ehud, but you know.
Judges isn't total. She's great, but yeah.
Speaking of imagery, I'm scarred from the Sunday school lesson on Ehud. Anybody else?
I like Ruth and Naomi and Boaz.
Yeah. Any other stories?
I settled on Joseph.
You decided on one. Okay. Joseph. Interesting. Which Joseph story, though? Joseph has several. The whole thing. Oh, you're casting a wide net. Okay. Any others? Esther. Yeah. You can run down the list of.
Well, you have to like Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego.
Yeah.
I like that one because they used to have that song. Basically they wouldn't be in and stuff. I thought that whole thing was good.
Yeah. I'll allow it, Brad. He's complaining you had two.
Okay,
Just telling you that.
every book in the Bible is his favorite. So I guess I can have.
Are you basing that on how long he spends on them?
I'm just saying, I guess I could have
Yeah,
two stories.
yeah. All right. Anybody just throw out a Bible story? Anybody else have? What other Bible stories come to mind when you think of stories in the Bible?
Paul's conversion.
Paul's conversion. Paul getting bit by a snake. Yeah.
Jesus' birth. Call that
Jesus'
the
birth,
Christmas
yeah.
story.
Jonah and the whale. That story got an entire book. Abraham and Isaac. So many of them in Genesis. Story after story. Noah. Moses. The entire Exodus.
The creation story.
The burning bush. The creation story. If you set long enough, you would just start thinking them more and more, and probably us talking about them has triggered other ideas, other thoughts, other memories of Bible stories. Many of them we learn in Sunday school, and some of them we don't learn in Sunday school, thankfully. There's the Bible, I think I told coming to Grace the other day about this, that the Bible is not child appropriate. You have to. I had someone tell me he knew a pastor that had a great idea. He was going to, and this is not Brad, by the way. He was gonna. They were gonna. Well, you'll be glad it's not Brad. They were gonna. They had this space between worship and the sermon that they wanted to fill, and they were gonna do scripture reading, which is a great idea. Except they were going to start in Genesis and read every verse, every like they were just going to read a few verses every Sunday. And somebody commented, "What are you going to do when you get to Song of Solomon?" And he said, "We'll just deal with it." Like, I don't think you understand. Yeah. So there are stories that they're just different. But the point is that all of these stories tell us something. And you remember them for a reason, because they captured your imagination. But each and every one of them tell us something. There's truths in that. And this quote from C.S. Lewis, which I loved, was, "If anyone thinks the Gospels are either legends or novels, then that person is simply showing his incompetence as a literary critic." And you may have heard people criticize the Bible as just a collection of stories. And it's not. It's part of what we've been talking about. It's this cohesive anthology is the word. An anthology is a collection of writings, independent writings. And the first week we talked about that. 40 plus authors, 1,600 years, 40 plus authors writing different parts of this whole book. What's amazing and what's miraculous about it is that it's woven together into this cohesive story. So even all of these Bible stories that we read and we've talked about, and they each have their nuances to them in and of themselves, but together they comprise the Bible. But what's the overarching story? There's a big story there. It's not the Sunday school answer, Brad. It is. It's Brad's up here cheating. It's the he read ahead. It's everything leading up to Jesus. It is the story of Jesus. It's the story of creation. It's how, and I said in the last week, last time we were here, it's the story of God, and it's also our story, because without us, he wouldn't have to. He wouldn't have to do all of this because we wouldn't have messed everything up. But it's the story of how he redeemed us through Jesus, and so all of these pieces fit together and come together in this overarching story. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting, I commented, Brad said Gideon, and I'll mention that one because we know about Gideon and his 300 men, but we don't really think about Gideon and the ephod that he created and how he led a whole bunch of people astray into idolatry, and his family fell apart after that. And so there's the downside. We know the story of Jonah and how Jonah went to Nineveh finally after God, pulled him, saved him with a whale and spit him up on shore, and he goes and he preaches in Nineveh, which is the irony. If you've ever seen the Jonah play at Sight and Sound, it's funny to see because he's preaching in 40 days Nineveh will be overturned, and you can say it either happened or it didn't, because Nineveh was overturned. It turned over, literally a new leaf. But the part of that we don't look at is Jonah sitting on a hillside whining and complaining because God didn't destroy the people that he wanted him to destroy. And so there's these elements that we see and we look at as we see them as Bible stories, and they're so much richer than that. Mine personally is, and I hadn't talked about this, but mine is Job, and which is maybe an interesting one. It's not one I didn't hear anybody mention Job, but Job is one of the most fascinating stories in the Bible to me because of what he goes through. And as I was thinking about Job, it occurred to me, and this is an interesting part about how we read the Bible. When we read a story in the Bible, we're reading it from a third-person perspective. We're outside looking in. Much as, in some ways, as we would see kind of God seeing the situation. He's looking into the thing and seeing it. So we see all this. But imagine Job's perspective on what he was experiencing. And as he stepped into this, we come to the end of the book of Job, and we've seen the whole story arc, this arc of his story, and how he, was taken down several notches by Satan. We see the scenes in heaven. We see the back and forth. We see how this plays out, and then we see God going to him and having the conversation. But from Job's perspective, if you step into his shoes, he sees everything go away. Everybody gripes at him. God shows up, puts him in his place, and then he gets all his stuff back. Then he's blessed again. He doesn't know the backstory. He doesn't know anything behind the scenes. And we don't talk about that in relation to Job, but it's important, and it's an important part of the story. And here's kind of what I'm getting to with this idea of the stories in the Bible, that when we look at these and we think, okay, Job's story would be very different from his perspective. Okay, what does my story look like from God's perspective? That's the part that puts me in my place, which is a heavy dose of humility, because I look at everything that I'm going through. And I said, earlier, pray for me, because I've got all of these things I'm dealing with. Okay, God sees everything that he's doing in the big picture. If my story was in the Bible, somebody would be reading that one day and going, man, this guy, why doesn't he get it? Like can't he see what God's doing here? And when we look at the Bible, we see that. We do that, and we look at it that way. But I think that's one of the lessons that we take away from something like Job, from all of these others, where we have this perspective. It's, I think, in order to humble us and bring us back to a way of looking at it. So why tell stories? So let's look at it from this perspective. So God gives us the Bible so that we understand truth. Why didn't God give us a textbook? Why did he give it to us this way?
It's more relatable this way. These are real people going through real situations that are somewhat similar to our own
Yeah.
situations.
Yeah. How many of you have ever read a novel or a book that you couldn't put down because the story was so riveting and you stayed up way later than you should have reading the story? Like, have you ever done that? Anybody? I see guilty faces and averted eyes. I'm like, most of them are. Katie's looking at me like, how many times have you done that? The number of times you've asked me, are you still up? How many times have you done that with a textbook or a legal document?
Wait, stay up late reading the textbook?
Not okay. Everybody but Charlie, because Charlie probably has done that with the textbook.
Wake up, read the textbook.
Yeah, well,
Boring, you know.
yeah. I've had drool on the textbook. This one means a lot to me, having just come out of all of the college classes Katie and I were in. I got so tired of reading textbooks. It's awful. And think about that, okay? So where did this originate? Well, this wasn't always written down. We talked about that. Some of the most interesting things about the Bible is how God put the right people in the right place at the right time with the right technology so that we could have written copies of the Bible. Moses was educated in Egypt in a time where there was papyrus to write on, so he could write things down. Before that, and in many cases after that, it was memorized. Well, how many of you are going to memorize lists of facts and rules and all of those things versus stories and, histories and things that have character and color to them? One of the things that I ran across in this is, talking about the Bible, and I mentioned what the Bible is about, but the idea of what the Bible tells us, the stories, the characters' actions and situations are not the story. The characters' actions and situations are how the story is told. So we talk about David and Goliath, but David is not the point of the story. What's the point of David's story?
God's faithfulness and power.
Yeah, God's faithfulness and power. If I said, tell me, describe David in a few words, my first thought is a man after God's own heart. Like, how do you describe that? If you look at Moses, if you look at Paul, if you look at any of the other people in the Bible, the story of Noah and the ark, what's the point of that story? God's faithful. Oh, God's faithfulness. Look at that. Here we are again. Each of these tell us something. It's not about the people. It's about the point.
I think it's easy to get lost. I think it's easy for us as people to get lost and see that, and we focus on the people, and sometimes, and I said this before with this group, or probably another group, is sometimes, no offense, Brad, but sometimes, in my past life, there's been some preachers that focused on, Peter or Paul or this, and they, held them up as an example, and I'm not saying they can't be an example, but the biggest example of their stories is about God and his faithfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those people, you know, as far as Peter, Paul, or anyone else, they would be appalled if you were holding them up as
Yeah.
better than, and then like, you missed the whole story. The
Right.
story is,
The point, yeah,
the point is God. It's not, the point is not me.
yeah. One of the verses in the Bible says, and I believe it's John the Baptist that says that he would increase and I would decrease. Paraphrasing, but that's the idea, is that it's the further I go, and I think the realization for me in my walk is that the more rich and full and, you know, and the closer my relationship is with God, the less I care about me and the more I care about him. And I think you're right. Everybody in the Bible that walked faithfully with God would say, no, it's not about me. And the ones that probably would feel differently about that probably stand out too.
I think sometimes, though, it's part of the church culture. If you think about if you grew up in church, like you think of David and Jonathan, and it'll be a lesson, like think about back into Sunday school, it'll be a lesson on how to be a good friend.
Mm-hmm.
It won't talk about how God provided a friend.
Yeah.
It's more about a practical lesson. And I think that's why we end up in those situations and we don't know the rest of the story. We don't know how Gideon, you know, did all these other things that maybe weren't so good.
Yeah.
Because we've made these little packages for Sunday school lessons for kids. And that's what we're all, you know, most of us were taught those. And so that's what we rely on.
Yeah. We talk about, and part of it is our choice in what stories we emphasize or don't emphasize. And I think it's an important reason we need to look at the Bible as a whole picture. There will be people who say, well, why do we even bother with the Old Testament? Because think about it. What would we not have if we didn't have the Old Testament? Like think about reading the New Testament with no context for the Old Testament. You know, most of the references, I mean, you from the very first image I've used over and over again with the cross references in the Bible. Imagine if that were, you know, you take out 75% of this. Everything from over in here over is gone. And it's 3/4 of the Bible. And so the whole thing is it's a whole story. It's not a collection of stories, and that's what I keep coming back to. But in that, so this is where the literature comes into it. There's these different styles, and I'll explain these if you're not familiar with what they are, because it's important. It's important to know. You think about like a proverb, which is there's an entire book called Proverbs. Well, what are they? They are wise sayings about how to live your life. They're wisdom from someone who has walked the path to someone who maybe hasn't been there yet, about ways to live your life. There's sayings, which are just kind of common phrases, and there'd be other wise sayings. And then we get into things that we're probably a little more familiar with, chronicles. A chronicle is a retelling of history. It's kind of a historical type of idea. There's a lament. Anybody know what a lament is?
And the Chiefs lose?
Yeah. Yeah, you'll see Chiefs fans lamenting when the Chiefs lose.
Not this week, though.
No. There's Lamentations. And we don't talk about this. We don't teach this, but there is lament is an aspect of mourning. It is crying out to God. In the context of the Bible, there are psalms of lament. You see Psalm and David. This is another aspect of David that is so interesting. You see David praise God in horrific situations, trials, and struggles. You'll see him lament things that are going on. and it is a mourning. There's oracles, which are like prophecies. There's apocalyptic literature. Apocalypse is the kind of the end times. What's the actual definition of apocalypse, Brad? Oh, man. It's 0 for 2. Psalms, which are songs that you think of. Hope was telling us one day, I told her she needed to do it for in church, was she learned a song in Hebrew. One of her Old Testament professor, was her Old Testament professor? I think was teaching them some songs in Hebrew, and it's interesting to hear them in the original language.
Well,
And-
Rick's been teaching us the Psalms.
Oh yeah.
on
Yeah.
Sunday.
Well, but in Hebrew,
Yes.
yes, yeah. Because we read them in English, and we don't think about them in their original language, that they actually would, because they don't rhyme, always for us. And then epistles, which are letters. So you see all of these different types, and each of these has numerous subtypes. There's different types of psalms. There's different types of letters and the pieces and parts in here. But okay, why does that matter? So if you were, how do I want to say this? So Jesus used parables to teach. Jesus used parables because people related, like what David was saying. They're very relatable. And so there was this kind of double aspect to it. So they were wisdom, there was deep wisdom in what he was saying, but it was only accessible to those who were really willing to listen. And but it was relatable stories for everybody. But the same thing, if Jesus were to stand up and lecture on the proper conduct of whatever in whatever situation, it's the same thing. It's the same thing we're talking about with textbooks versus stories. You understand, you listen to a storyteller far better than you listen to a professor lecturing. Anybody experience that?
Something to hang it on,
Do what?
because you have something to hang it on, that's the way our memory works.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
That's the way we organize our brains, so if it's in a story format, that's with education, and that's why you try to tell things in a certain way, or and get people to associate words with other things, because then you can kind of relate that to another word, when you're trying to teach vocabulary or something else, when you haven't ever heard that word before, you try to break it down. That's why they, spend time on doing, breaking down words and saying, okay, what does pro mean? And
Right.
all those different things, because otherwise you don't know what that word is in the science book.
Yeah. If you another way to think about it is, okay, you look at something like 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. Those are types of histories. Those are meant to tell us the history of Israel, and they're meant to tell us essentially roughly a chronological telling. And 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, they overlap because it's different. Some of it's at the same time. Well, and let me back up here. So the Bible is not chronological. If you've read the Bible for in any extent, you understand the Bible is not chronological. The Bible is grouped, and we've talked about this. The Bible is grouped into categories. So you've got the histories, the law, the creation, all of that, and then you have the history of the kingdoms. You have Israel, you have wisdom literature, you have prophets, you have all of these different groupings. So that's how the Bible is organized, and it's not chronological, and you can't read it chronologically. So that's one thing that we have to keep in mind. You can read it chronologically, yes.
You can read it
Yeah.
chronologically.
Have you ever read it chronologically?
I started that. But I didn't finish
It's hard. I did read the Bible chronologically all the way through one time, and some of it is really, really bizarre because you realize when things happened. And it's interesting because, I hadn't thought about this until just now, but there are parts that don't make sense as much to me if you read it chronologically, because because what's written is jumping back and forth. You'll see you have a psalm in the middle of 1 Kings or 2 Kings, and yes, that it puts it in context of the chronology, but I'm not thinking about reading a psalm. I'm reading history. And there are part which I think emphasizes the idea that psalms are meant to convey as much emotion as they are a truth. So they do convey a truth, but they're meant to convey an emotion too, and to bring that out and tie that to an emotion. Because when you have an emotional anchor in relation to a story, that sinks it that much further. But if you look at how the stories are told, so there's the difference between in when you look at the Bible, it's important to know what you're reading. So if you're reading a psalm or you're reading and the first one here is a perfect example, narrative versus satire. When you read satire, if you've ever read anything that's a satire, which is typically it is a true story told in what I would call a somewhat mocking way or ridicule. It's intended to there's a target and it's intended to ridicule them or make light of them, or we see this oftentimes people who think they're very, very important, there will be a lot of satire about them to kind of take them down a notch. But the thing is you can't read satire as a historical account. If you were reading satire, that's not facts and statements of truth about a situation. It's intended to make light of something. So you have to understand the target. If you're reading a narrative, a story about something that actually happened, that's a different way of reading something. You don't read that. You read that for the facts, the characters, the action that's happening. Today we see this in the news. How many of you read or watch the news and know that everything that you read is 100% true? Nobody? Why is it not true? Why can you not read, and this has nothing to do with political persuasion, this is why can you not read the news or watch the news and know that everything is 100% true?
Because it's biased.
Because it's biased.
Everybody's got an agenda. It's going one way or another.
Even people who don't have an agenda which is trying not to have an agenda. You think about that. Even the most neutral people are trying to make sure they're telling it in exactly the right way. You cannot have anything told by a human that is 100% accurate. This is why the inspiration of the Bible is so important. Because without the inspiration, it's not, if God's not guiding this, we can't trust it. And the Bible proves over and over again that it's trustworthy. So so much of what we read in the news, we understand, we read it as partial truth. There's truth there. We take it, and when you take news and you take multiple sources, what do you look for? If you have multiple sources of news, if you want to know the truth, what do you look for? Brad said, what overlaps? What's the same between them? What's interesting is when you look at the Bible, the Bible artifacts that exist, the writings, the early writings, this is how they interpret the Bible and translate the Bible. And when they look at those artifacts, they are uncannily similar. Like there is less disparity and difference and drift in any Bible writings than any other artifact and than any other piece of literature in history, which is amazing given how complex it is. So when you're reading the Bible, it's important for that reason to understand, okay, what is the author trying to say, but how is the author trying to say it? And what type of literature am I reading? These other examples, expository versus literary, we talked about textbook versus narrative and what that looks like. there are archetypes and themes. An archetype is a character. There's another term called a motif that you'll see used, but an archetype is the hero, the joker, the villain, the deceiver. Any of those recognizable in the Bible? Anybody? Deceiver, does that show up anywhere in the Bible? How many stories can you immediately think of that? Garden of Eden, I heard Jacob, you start, looking at all of these. Even Judas. There's these character types is what an archetype is. And then there's themes. And it's important to understand themes as well. And themes is something we will come back to. Brad, you're not allowed to answer this one because I know you've studied this. Can anybody identify a theme that exists through the whole Bible other than Jesus? Taking away the Sunday school answers. Sin, okay.
God loved us.
Anything more concrete?
Good and evil.
Good and evil? Hope. They're actually, and these, all of these are good. They're all truths that are in the Bible. But have you ever noticed water as a theme in the Bible? Where do we first see water? In the beginning. What's the last reference to water in the Bible? And the sea will be no more. Revelation. Light, darkness, trees. What's the first reference to trees in the Bible? Creation. Then where do they show up? Tree of life, knowledge of good and evil. Where do we end up in the Bible with trees? The tree of life. There's these themes that exist across, and themes are something that are important. It's important in literature. And it's one thing to have a story. If we were to see Job's story or Jonah's story or anything else with and trees were in that or whatever. But we're talking about themes that run through all of these different types of literature, all of the different stories in the Bible, all of the different books of the Bible. These threads are woven through there. And if you're not looking for them, I had no idea that there were ideas like this. How often do shepherds and sheep show up in the Bible? So those are the things that that jump out at us. And when I asked in the beginning, what are your favorite Bible stories? Many of them have these themes that resonate. God's faithfulness and deliverance, the truth that we adhere to, that we cling to. There are a couple other aspects of this too that I want to touch on, which is the style and rhetoric, and that goes to the style that the author is using to tell the story, but then rhetoric is a way of communicating, and you see this show up later in the Bible in the more Greek-inspired literature. Paul's writings in his letters does this, and it's where you see this idea of presenting a set of ideas. You present points. You make a connection you present your points, and then you reinforce that. And this is the kind of a classic debate type idea, and you see these things show up. And Paul uses this style, and that's how he was educated. And understanding that helps us in how we look at the Bible and what we understand about it. And then the last one here is artistry. And probably many of us relate to that. What is it, when you think of someone as an artist or using artistry, why would that be important to how God conveys the story of the Bible? Why do people think art's important? Why do people like art? It's expression.
When you go back to your tech manual, in the military, I've read many, many helicopters, tech manuals on how to fly a helicopter, how to repair a helicopter, how to do all that kind of stuff. And it's extremely dry reading. There is nothing that puts anything into your mind or your heart to think about. It's just following directions. It's just do this and it'll be fixed. If you don't do this, it won't be fixed. But there's nothing to drive a person to seek more.
Artistry is like God's creation, and it shows the beauty. And if we didn't have that beauty woven within the scripture, whether you're talking about, music, whether you're talking about visual arts, whatever it is, because artistry, whether it's how you put words together and make them flow in a more poetic, way.
Yeah.
That, I think it shows more of another aspect of God, because without the artistry, you just have to know that someone who made the Grand Canyon and everything else and all the different things, that's a part of who he is.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And that's what makes, I don't know about you guys, but pictures and things that we try to do and creativity, what would our world look like if we didn't have artistic expression? Whether we're able to do it or not is not the important thing. Is we enjoy that and do that, and it serves not only to lift up your soul, but it also is a way of communication.
What's the first thing we read about God doing in the Bible? Creating. And that act of creation is, and to me, to say that God is anything other than an artist, the finest artist, is to criticize God, because he's, all of this is because of him. And so everything, and even when he finished creation, he said it is very good. This is, it doesn't get any better than this. And so I think art and artistry and that idea of craft and craftsmanship and all of those elements speak to a part of us that resonates with God. Because we are made in his image, and therefore there's a part of us, I think, that resonates with that. Stories do that for us. They resonate with part of us, but art and artistry, these pictures that I chose, again, they all have stories associated with them. I look at them and I can tell you a story about so many of them. There was a sunrise hike at Arches National Park. We hiked to see this scene. And, I've seen, many beautiful things in my life. This was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. And we had nothing to do with it. God did all of it. And I feel like there's a huge part of what we read in the Bible that's the same thing, is the authors are pouring themselves into what's being written with the guidance of the Holy Spirit in order to make that connection with, because ultimately what's God doing? He's trying to communicate with our souls. He's trying to communicate with us and draw us back to him. And that happens at the most basic level, at a very visceral level that goes, I think, all the way back to creation. Stories tell us a lot. There's so much woven into what's in the Bible that we don't even read. Are there any parts, and I'm just kind of thinking through this when it relates to, is there anything about the Bible that has surprised you? When I've read, like I talked about Job, that was a surprise for me. Actually sitting thinking about Job from Job's perspective. Give me a whole different view of it. But is there anything, has the Bible ever surprised you?
Hosea, Abraham and Isaac. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Well, the patience of God. You know, I think when we did Revelation, it was just another reminder over and over again. God gives people chance after chance.
Yeah. The patience of God comes through. Talking about the Amalekites, would you say it was 1,000 years? Think about that. God tolerated whatever they were doing, because we don't see a lot about them. We see them just like 2 or 3 times in the Bible, but imagine what was happening in the meantime. And God was patient with them. I mean, look at what he puts up with from us now. We want to look back on the people in the Bible and think, oh, wow, they were uneducated and pagan and didn't know what they were doing. They weren't nearly as cultured as us.
I think what happens the most to me growing up in church and that, but making it personal, that God is always searching. I mean, when you talk about the 99, looking for the one, and the creation of the earth and the creation of the word and using all the different styles, because he's trying to reach different people. Because some people respond, not that we're not supposed to read the whole Bible, I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying some of us respond strongly to Paul's writings. Some of us respond strongly to other people's writings, right?
Yes,
They speak
yeah.
to us. Like, I really like James. He's very direct. He's not long-winded, even though right now I'm long-winded. But you know what I'm saying? Do you know what I'm saying? There's different
Absolutely.
things that,
Oh, yeah.
that speak to us. God knew that. He did it all with a purpose to reach you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not just to reach everybody, but to reach you.
Yeah.
And until you take it that personal, that he did all that to reach you, I think we miss the point sometimes. I mean, he wants everybody, and we need to try to do that evangelism, but if we don't take it personally, then we've missed the whole point.
Yeah. Some people are moved by songs. Some people are moved by arguments. And those are 2 very different things. And, and here's the part about this that gets, I don't know, really, really intimidating for me. The Bible reaching you is one thing. But God, and don't get scared off by this, but God may be using the Bible to reach you to reach somebody else. Because, and I don't know if you've heard this phrase before, but you may be the only Bible somebody ever reads. And I think of like tonight at Restoration Life, and we were sitting there and I heard, and you may not want me to say this, but I heard Katie, sitting down, introducing herself to people and talking to them and greeting them. And I've heard stories recently about people going to church for the first time and meeting, and it wasn't anything, they didn't talk about the message, they didn't talk about the worship music, they didn't talk about the sanctuary, they talked about the people they met. And one person I'm thinking of in particular that I saw online talking about had not been to church. I don't know if they'd ever been or hadn't been in decades. And they said they were going back because the people were so kind. And they don't live a lifestyle that is anywhere aligned with what the church that they went to was aligned with, they would have been very much standing out like a sore thumb. But the people loved them well, and that's, you know, so that can be intimidating. But it's also, what is God teaching us through this? He's teaching us how to treat people, because look how He treated us. And I think you're right. And there are all of these different ways that He reaches. But we're also learning, you think about that, learn Psalms, learn lament, learn Chronicles, learn Proverbs, learn all of those things, not necessarily in an academic way, but learn how to communicate with people in different ways. Because you don't know what's going to resonate with someone. And you may, what may be frustrating when you're trying to talk with someone or witness to someone, maybe just needs you to pivot your approach.
I think one of the things that surprised me about the Bible, now that I'm gray-haired and old, is you mentioned the story of Job. I can remember studying it as a kid, and there was something that, I was like, oh yeah, I can kind of relate to this. And then there was reading it as a teenager. And when I read it as a teenager, I was thinking of Job as like my father, and I'm his son that died. How would that make him feel? And how did he have the strength to, to try to work through the process?
Mm-hmm.
Then I became a father. And now I'm looking at this as, this is my son, how do I work through this if I was to lose my child?
Yeah.
And the thing is that that's what makes the Bible so great, is that these stories have lasted the ages, because they apply, the same story applies differently to each part of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And now that I'm getting gray-haired and old, and all the gray hairs are probably in the room here, probably think a little bit about it, that we're kind of nearing the end of our life. And we kind of look at the Bible a little differently, and look at it going, my goodness, how much I need to really try to get the word out. How much time have I wasted, like Jonah, sitting there in the shade, and things like that.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's what makes the Bible so great, again, is that it not only applies, it applies at different points of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you need to continue to search God's will by reading the Word, because there will be something that comes up that you're going to need some help on, or some guidance on.
Yeah. Which sets it up perfectly for next week. We'll move into reading for prayer and communion. So we'll take what we know from the Bible about God and the way He communicates with us, and look at how that influences our relationship with Him, our communication back to God, and our fellowship with Him. So that will be next week. Any other comments, questions? I did not pass out cards this week, so if you have a question, you're going to have to ask it. Okay. I will dismiss us in prayer then.